The room stayed quiet while names came out slow, spoken by men who once treated silence like insurance rather than loyalty. Nobody was crying, nobody explaining themselves, just defendants sitting upright while murders from kitchens and sidewalks entered the public record. That was the moment things flipped, when cooperation stopped being a rumor and started sounding official. What made it heavy was how calm everybody looked, like this ending had been priced in years earlier. Only then does it make sense to rewind back to a place where nobody thought courtrooms would ever matter. Back in the late 80s and early 90s, the Short North and Wineland Park did not look like the postcard stretch people know today, since those blocks sat caught between neglect and opportunity. Old factories had already shed jobs, landlords stopped fixing buildings, and entire streets leaned towards survival rather than ambition. Open-air drug markets grew without much resistance, partly since police coverage stayed thin and community trust had been worn down. That gap allowed neighborhood crews to step into roles that mixed protection, intimidation, and business without calling it any of those things out loud. Most of the young dudes involved were not thinking about gang legacies or national affiliations during those early years, since the focus stayed local and practical. Corners mattered more than symbols, and knowing who supplied what carried more weight than colors or slogans. Outsiders trying to sell drugs without permission quickly learned they were not welcome, which spread word faster than any formal warning. That pressure built a loose sense of order, where enforcement happened quietly through reputation rather than immediate violence. People who lived there during that period remember the posse starting as a neighborhood answer to chaos, not a headline-ready organization. The logic sounded simple at first, since controlling who sold drugs meant fewer random conflicts and fewer outsiders bringing heat. Younger kids watched older guys handle disputes through conversation before fists, then through fists before weapons. Over time, those steps compressed and force started feeling like a shortcut rather than a last resort. Clothing and appearance became early markers of identity, though nothing stayed uniform or official at that stage. Members favored fresh sneakers, clean jackets, and recognizable looks that said local without screaming gang affiliation. Reputation moved block to block through word of mouth, where being known carried value similar to currency. If somebody respected you, they listened. And if they listened, you did not need to repeat yourself. Rules existed without being written, which made them flexible and dangerous at the same time. Do not bring outsiders without checking first, do not steal from within, and do not invite police attention. Breaking those rules usually led to conversations before consequences, although repeated disrespect shortened that patience quickly. Those informal systems held things together just enough to feel stable, even while tension stayed constant underneath. As the early 90s rolled forward, money started changing the tone, since steady drug profits altered expectations and ambition. What began as defensive control turned into an economic opportunity that rewarded boldness more than restraint. Violence had not fully taken over yet, but it was no longer unthinkable either. That shift mattered, since it trained people to see force as a usable option instead of a failure. By the mid-90s, the Short North posse no longer functioned like a loose neighborhood circle, since scale demanded structure. Drug distribution stretched beyond single corners, linking suppliers, runners, and lookouts into something resembling a system. Money flowed more consistently, which meant mistakes carried higher stakes and discipline started tightening. Internal disputes no longer stayed personal, since conflict threatened profit instead of pride alone. Police pressure arrived in waves rather than constant presence, which shaped how the posse adapted. Early investigations and arrests took recognizable faces off the street, but the organization did not collapse afterward. Younger members stepped into gaps quickly, already trained through observation rather than instruction. Incarceration turned into a pause instead of an ending, allowing continuity to survive without formal leadership meetings. During this period, robberies entered the mix as a parallel income stream, often targeting rival dealers or loosely connected operators. Those hits were not random, since information traveled through personal relationships and neighborhood gossip. Knowing who kept cash or drugs inside their homes mattered more than brute force. Planning became quieter, with roles assigned based on trust and familiarity rather than bravado. Reputation evolved into leverage, where fear reduced resistance before conflict even started. People heard stories long before seeing faces, which did half the work already. That reputation followed members even when they moved between neighborhoods, creating influence without constant presence. The posse learned that being known could generate compliance without direct confrontation. Internal discipline also sharpened, especially regarding loyalty and silence. Talking to police became the unforgivable line, while other offenses stayed negotiable depending on context. That code hardened through shared experience, reinforced by watching what happened to those who violated it. Fear and belonging blended together, making exit difficult without consequences. As years passed, violence stopped being reactive, since planning replaced impulse. Conflicts got anticipated, routes got studied, and outcomes got discussed beforehand. That transition marked a turning point, since killing was no longer framed as retaliation, but as problem solving. From there, the distance between the neighborhood crew and the execution unit shrank fast, even if nobody said it out loud yet. By the early 2000s, the Short North Posse reached a point where regular hustling could no longer absorb rising pressure from rivals, debts, and internal disputes. Money moved faster, territory stretched wider, and arguments carried consequences that could not be settled with talks alone anymore. That shift created space for specialization, where certain members stopped selling drugs regularly and started handling problems others wanted kept distant. This change did not arrive with ceremony, but through quiet agreement that some work required colder hands. The Cutthroat Committee formed during that period as a small circle trusted to handle robberies, intimidation, and eliminations tied to business disputes. Membership stayed limited, since secrecy mattered more than numbers, and loyalty carried higher value than muscle alone. These men did not walk around advertising their role, yet everyone inside the posse understood who handled enforcement when conversations failed. Violence turned into assignment-based labor, discussed using plain language rather than emotional talk. Robberies followed a methodical pattern, usually targeting dealers believed to store cash or product inside homes rather than on corners. Information came from girlfriends, associates, or loose talk overheard at parties and bars. Planning focused on timing, entry points, and exit routes, reducing chaos during execution. When things went wrong, consequences were absorbed internally, not debated publicly. Killings followed similar logic, framed as solutions to ongoing risks rather than reactions to disrespect. Some hits connected directly to money, removing someone who owed large sums or threatened supply lines. Others aimed at fear management, sending a message that silence and compliance mattered more than survival. Inside conversations described these acts as necessary maintenance, using business language instead of moral framing. That separation created distance for leadership figures who rarely appeared at scenes or carried weapons publicly. Orders moved downward through trusted intermediaries, allowing deniability while outcomes remained controlled. This structure insulated decision makers from immediate fallout while increasing brutality at the street level. Everyone involved understood the balance, even if nobody described it formally. Over time, the Cutthroat Committee evolved into what prosecutors later labeled the Homicide Squad, reflecting its narrowing focus. Robberies continued, yet killings became more frequent and deliberate. Members chosen for that role were expected to operate without hesitation or public recognition. Their value came from reliability, not visibility. Internal language reinforced that mindset, since members spoke about jobs completed rather than lives taken. Success meant avoiding witnesses, controlling narratives, and maintaining operational calm. Failure meant exposure, retaliation, or internal consequences. Emotional detachment became a survival skill rather than a personality trait. This structure allowed the posse to function with efficiency while projecting fear beyond its immediate footprint. Outsiders sensed danger without understanding the mechanics, which amplified the effect. Inside, the system normalized killing as task fulfillment, not personal vendetta. That normalization laid the groundwork for what followed. Robert Ledbetter did not rise through the Short North Posse by talking loud or chasing attention, since credibility carried heavier weight than charisma. People around him noticed how he moved carefully, choosing moments rather than reacting impulsively. His reputation grew through consistency, especially during situations others avoided or mishandled. That reliability earned trust from both peers and subordinates. Ledbetter's nickname, Killer B, did not emerge as marketing, but as street shorthand tied to enforcement outcomes people remembered. He handled pressure calmly, which mattered when stakes involved money, silence, or retaliation. Associates described him as steady rather than flashy, someone who preferred planning over improvisation. That approach aligned well with the posse's shift toward organized violence. Personal grievance played a role in shaping his trajectory, especially after his brother was killed in 2006. Ledbetter believed Alan Johnson was responsible, even though official records never confirmed that claim conclusively. That belief hardened his outlook, blending revenge with organizational logic. When Johnson was murdered in April 2006, prosecutors later tied the hit directly to Ledbetter's orchestration. Witness testimony described how Ledbetter coordinated that killing through others, avoiding direct exposure. He gathered information, arranged transport, and ensured payment afterward. Those steps reflected pattern rather than anomaly, showing a method already in place. The murder reinforced his authority inside the posse, proving capability rather than broadcasting intent. Ledbetter's influence expanded further through relationships with women who moved money, information, and logistics quietly. Crystal Fife became central in that network, handling errands and relaying messages without drawing attention. Her proximity provided convenience while increasing risk, especially as federal investigations intensified. That dual role later placed her in fatal danger. As enforcement operations expanded, Ledbetter's name surfaced repeatedly in planning stages, even when he stayed physically absent. Members of the homicide squad looked to him for direction and approval. He did not need to attend meetings frequently since trust replaced constant oversight. Decisions flowed outward from him, shaping outcomes across neighborhoods. His leadership style relied on selective communication, sharing details only with those who needed them. That limited exposure protected him while reinforcing hierarchy. Associates knew questioning orders carried consequences, even without explicit threats. Authority existed through expectation rather than force alone. The murder of Marshall Brumfield Jr. in November 2007 further illustrated Ledbetter's operational role. Testimony showed how he identified Brumfield as a profitable target, coordinated surveillance, and approved the robbery that turned fatal. He stayed removed from immediate violence, yet controlled direction and aftermath. That distance shielded him temporarily from law enforcement scrutiny. Ledbetter's most chilling act occurred while incarcerated, demonstrating reach beyond physical presence. In October 2011, Crystal Fife was murdered after cooperating with investigators. Prosecutors argued Ledbetter ordered the hit from jail, fearing her testimony. Letters and witness statements supported that narrative, revealing how influence persisted despite confinement. That moment exposed how deeply embedded his authority had become, extending through fear and loyalty combined. Even locked away, his words carried lethal consequences. The operation now had a clear center of gravity, one that did not require constant motion. Power rested in coordination rather than confrontation. By the time federal indictments landed in 2014, Ledbetter's name anchored much of the case narrative. Prosecutors portrayed him as an organizer rather than a triggerman, emphasizing orchestration over execution. That framing matched how the posse functioned internally for years. Violence had become delegated labor, directed from a steady core. Ledbetter's eventual conviction in 2016 for multiple murders, including ordering Fife's death, closed a chapter shaped by calculated control. His sentence reflected accumulated decisions rather than singular acts. Looking back, his rise appears less like a sudden ascent and more like inevitable consolidation. The posse had grown around him quietly, forming a structure that mirrored his methodical approach. The killings did not arrive as one chaotic burst, since they unfolded gradually across years where confidence grew through repetition. Early incidents blended robbery with intimidation, usually targeting people believed to keep cash nearby. Information traveled through social circles, whispered during parties, phone calls, and casual conversations. Each move followed similar preparation, with scouting, transportation, and timing discussed beforehand. Success reinforced belief that the system worked, which pushed boundaries further. One of the earliest cases later tied to the posse involved Tyron Hill in May 2005, though details stayed murky even afterward. Street talk suggested a dispute linked to gambling and money, while official records offered limited clarity. What mattered internally was the lack of consequences, which reinforced the sense of insulation. When no arrests followed, confidence quietly increased. That absence of accountability became instructional rather than accidental. In July 2005, Sanaqua Hester was killed during what many believe began as a robbery attempt. Neighbors recalled confusion and sudden violence, while rumors floated about mistaken identity. Court documents later connected the incident to individuals associated with the posse without charging specific defendants. That gap between street certainty and legal proof widened distrust of institutions. For those watching, it confirmed the streets handled outcomes more than courts. January 2006 brought the killing of Michael Teague, another case shaped by money and perceived vulnerability. Teague operated on the margins, known to carry drugs occasionally without strong protection. Accounts described a planned encounter rather than a spontaneous conflict, though details varied. No immediate arrests followed, which reinforced patterns already forming. Each unresolved case stacked weight onto the next. April 2006 marked a turning point with the murder of Alan Johnson, which carried a clearer motive and organization. Ledbetter believed Johnson played a role in his brother's death, which reframed the hit as personal and strategic. Witness testimony later described coordination involving transportation, location confirmation, and payment afterward. Johnson was killed outside his residence, with attackers leaving quickly. That case solidified how revenge could merge with operational structure. Following Johnson's death, internal belief shifted toward inevitability rather than risk. Members discussed outcomes using matter-of-fact language, focusing on execution rather than consequence. That mindset carried into August 2007, when Donathan Moon was killed during a home invasion. The target was believed to host gambling and store money, which made his residence attractive. When the robbery escalated, gunfire followed, leaving Moon dead. Court testimony later detailed how the crew forced entry, searched rooms, and reacted when resistance appeared. Moon attempted to hide, yet shots were fired through a closed door, sealing his fate. The robbery failed to deliver the expected profit, which frustrated participants afterward. Still, lack of swift arrests minimized internal concern. The operation continued unchanged. October 2007 brought the murder of Marcus Peters, a case clouded by internal suspicion. Peters was associated with the posse, but reportedly talked too freely, raising trust concerns. Rumors suggested silencing rather than robbery motivated the killing, though charges never followed. His death served as a reminder that membership did not guarantee safety. Fear tightened loyalty, discouraging dissent. November 2007 saw Rodriguez Williams killed during another home invasion, this time in Pickerington. Williams lived outside the immediate neighborhood, signaling an expanding reach. Witnesses later testified that Ledbetter coordinated surveillance and timing remotely. The crew forced entry late at night, confronting Williams near his family. Shots were fired, killing him quickly. That incident demonstrated growing boldness, since suburban locations carried higher visibility. Yet again, arrests did not follow immediately, reinforcing perceived immunity. The success fueled belief that distance from the short north offered no protection. For rivals and associates alike, the message traveled fast. December 2007 added another layer with the killing of Dante Hill during a marijuana transaction. Hill met with Deontay Ussery, expecting a simple exchange. An argument followed, ending with Hill shot and robbed. Later, appellate rulings questioned whether the murder furthered racketeering aims, though the killing itself remained undisputed. The nuance mattered legally, not operationally. Around that same period, Ella Palmer, an elderly woman, was killed during a robbery, targeting her grandson's alleged drug ties. Neighbors described shock at the victim's age, which intensified community fear. No charges followed, leaving the case unresolved officially. Street narratives framed it as collateral damage from unchecked aggression. The event deepened resentment toward the posse. March 2008 brought the killing of Shane McEwen, often described as a mistaken target. Reports suggested assailants believed he held drugs or cash, which proved incorrect. The robbery turned fatal after confusion escalated. Again, no immediate arrest followed. Each unresolved outcome fed the illusion of control. April 2008 saw Tyrell Davis, a teenager, shot while walking home, likely misidentified as a rival. That killing drew quiet outrage within the neighborhood, though fear limited cooperation. The randomness alarmed residents who previously felt insulated. Internally, mistakes were acknowledged privately, yet operations continued. Consequences still felt distant. The pattern shifted again in November 2007 with Marshall Brumfield Jr., whose killing blended robbery with execution. Brumfield was known as a dealer carrying product and cash. Testimony later described how the crew followed him home, forced entry, and demanded valuables. When resistance appeared, multiple shooters fired, killing him inside his residence. That case featured heavy planning, including surveillance and role assignment. Ledbetter stayed removed physically, directing logistics and receiving confirmation afterward. The robbery yielded drugs and money, reinforcing the incentive structure. Brumfield's death tightened fear across dealer networks. Word spread that compliance mattered more than negotiation. The final killing tied directly to silencing involved Crystal Fife in October 2011. Fife previously assisted Ledbetter with errands and logistics, placing her near sensitive information. As federal investigations intensified, she began cooperating with authorities. Letters and testimony later indicated Ledbetter feared her disclosures. She was shot outside her home with nothing stolen. Early media reports mischaracterized Fife's death, causing confusion and delay. That misreporting bought time, which benefited those involved. When prosecutors revisited the case, patterns emerged linking it to previous operations. Fife's murder differed in motive, focusing solely on silence. That distinction later carried weight in court. Across these cases, repetition bred familiarity rather than caution. Each successful operation reduced perceived risk, encouraging expansion. Patterns became predictable to investigators over time, even if participants missed that shift. Confidence turned into exposure slowly. What once felt invisible began leaving traces. By the time federal indictments arrived, many involved never imagined these files reopening. Years passed between crimes and courtroom reckoning, reinforcing complacency. Yet repetition created records, witnesses, and connections. That accumulation transformed confidence into vulnerability. The same patterns that ensured control ultimately mapped the entire operation. Silence inside the posse did not shatter all at once, since it thinned slowly under pressure from stacked sentences and shrinking options. Years inside county jails and federal holding cells changed how people weighed loyalty against survival. Conversations shifted tone, moving from bravado toward calculation once paperwork replaced rumors. Nobody announced cooperation early, yet small decisions quietly rearranged the entire structure. Plea deals entered the picture as leverage rather than confession, offering reduced exposure in exchange for limited information. Some members talked around facts, confirming timelines without naming shooters directly. Others offered context, explaining roles while avoiding emotional language. Each agreement peeled back a layer, turning internal secrets into usable evidence. Mistrust grew alongside that erosion, since nobody could be certain who already spoke privately. Old alliances weakened once doubt replaced confidence, making coordination riskier. People stopped sharing details freely, which slowed operations and increased mistakes. That isolation damaged cohesion more than arrests ever had. Remorse rarely surfaced during testimony, since most statements focused on logistics and verification. Witnesses spoke plainly, describing vehicles, locations, and sequences rather than feelings. That approach reframed violence as an activity rather than a passion. Jurors later heard stories stripped of drama, which made them harder to dismiss. Informants reshaped the narrative from within, correcting myths while confirming patterns outsiders only suspected. Street rumors gained clarity once matched against call logs and receipts. Small details like meeting spots and nicknames filled gaps prosecutors struggled with earlier. Each addition sharpened the overall picture. Some cooperators never saw themselves as traitors, framing decisions as practical exits from losing positions. Others justified talking by pointing at the leadership distance during arrests. Those rationalizations mattered less than the cumulative effect. Information stacked quietly until silence no longer protected anyone. By the time cooperation became visible publicly, momentum already leaned toward exposure. The posse's story started telling itself through intersecting accounts. Law enforcement did not need hero witnesses, only consistency. That transition carried the narrative naturally toward federal involvement. Operation Get Shorty did not appear suddenly, since it grew from years of overlapping investigations and shared frustration. Local police tracked cases individually, while federal agencies mapped broader connections. Information sat dormant until patterns aligned across jurisdictions. Patience mattered more than speed during that phase. Surveillance accumulated through phone records, financial trails, and cooperating witnesses confirming each other unintentionally. Investigators compared stories told years apart, finding alignment where randomness once seemed dominant. Unsolved murders gained new meaning once placed beside each other chronologically. Racketeering logic turned isolated violence into enterprise evidence. Arrests happened incrementally, often tied to secondary charges rather than headline cases. Those early detentions applied pressure without alerting the entire network. Each interview produced fragments that later connected. Nothing moved fast, yet direction stayed steady. Federal prosecutors avoided spectacle, focusing instead on documentation and corroboration. Indictments required showing structure, intent, and continuity rather than individual guilt alone. That threshold demanded time, since shortcuts risked collapse. The weight frustrated communities seeking closure, yet groundwork kept strengthening. By the early 2010s, investigators possessed enough material to frame the posse as organized operation rather than loose association. Years of violence now shared context through communication records and testimony. The Homicide Squad label carried legal weight once tied to recurring roles. That classification changed everything. When indictments finally landed in 2014, their weight came from scope rather than surprise. Multiple defendants faced charges simultaneously, revealing depth previously hidden. The paperwork read like a ledger, listing murders, robberies, and coordination spanning years. No dramatic raids followed, only procedural processing. Courtrooms filled with names long whispered on streets, now read aloud officially. Families heard connections confirmed that rumors had hinted at for years. Defendants recognized how far the net extended only then. The long wait ended not with chaos, but with structure closing in. When the trials began, nothing about the process felt theatrical, since most of it unfolded through documents, timelines, and layered testimony. Prosecutors did not chase dramatic confessions, relying instead on an accumulation that grew heavier with each witness. Jurors heard the same routes, phone numbers, and meeting spots described by different people years apart. That repetition carried weight, since alignment mattered more than emotional delivery. Several witnesses changed their posture once sworn, pulling back earlier statements or softening language under pressure. Those reversals did not collapse cases, since corroboration existed elsewhere in records and testimony. Phone logs, travel patterns, and financial movements filled gaps left by wavering voices. Each correction tightened the overall structure rather than weakening it. The trials showed how violence functioned as coordinated labor, presented without dramatic flourish or graphic detail. Testimony stayed focused on logistics, describing who called whom and where people traveled afterward. That plain delivery stripped excuses from the narrative, replacing myth with sequence. Jurors followed threads patiently rather than reacting to moments. Verdicts arrived piece by piece, not all at once, reflecting the complexity of overlapping cases. Some defendants accepted plea agreements before verdicts, while others faced jury decisions. Sentences ranged from decades to life terms, structured around racketeering statutes rather than individual acts alone. The court treated outcomes as closure mechanisms, not moral conclusions. Appellate reviews followed, questioning specific applications rather than denying underlying facts. One conviction related to Dante Hill was vacated on technical grounds, illustrating legal nuance without erasing the killing itself. Other appeals failed, leaving sentences intact. The process emphasized precision rather than spectacle. Families heard names spoken publicly that once lived only in whispers. Defendants listened as histories were summarized officially, removing ambiguity that once protected them. The courtroom became a mirror reflecting years of street logic back toward its origin. Visibility replaced secrecy, changing how the story would be remembered. The trials did not end the story, since they only marked when silence lost its power. What followed mattered just as much, reshaping how neighborhoods understood their own past. Closure arrived administratively, not emotionally, leaving space for questions to linger. That lingering mattered more than any single verdict. After the posse collapsed, the The short north and Wineland Park shifted quietly rather than dramatically. New buildings replaced old structures, and businesses arrived where corners once stayed contested. Change came through investment and time, not public ceremony. Many residents barely recognized streets shaped by earlier fear. Gentrification altered who lived there, creating distance between memory and present experience. Newcomers walked paths without knowing what unfolded there years earlier. Older residents carried recollections privately, rarely sharing details with outsiders. That gap created a silence different from before, built on forgetting rather than fear. Some questions never received answers, especially surrounding unsolved cases and rumored motives. Official records covered much, yet left edges unfinished. Street narratives persisted, passed selectively between those who remembered. Truth existed in fragments, shaped by perspective and loss. Violence had operated quietly for years, maintained through routine rather than chaos. Jobs were assigned, information moved, and consequences followed predictably. That regularity allowed harm to blend into daily life unnoticed by outsiders. Exposure came only after time connected patterns that once seemed isolated. The ending mirrors the beginning, returning to courtrooms where names surfaced publicly at last. Men, once confident in silence, watched history recited without embellishment. Nothing about that moment felt sudden, since the clock had been running for decades. The story closes without resolution, leaving continuity where certainty once lived.